Hi there, history buffs. As we get started today, I wanted to show you one of my favorite t-shirts in the world. If you can see it, it might be backwards. It's Tecumseh. I actually have been to Chillicothe, Ohio a couple times to see the live reenactment of the life and times of Tecumseh. So, would recommend if you haven't seen, if you have seen, let me know what you thought, because he is one of the greatest heroes in my mind. And today, in this short mini lecture, I wanted to get to the basics of sort of Indian removal. I'll have you watching We Hold the Rock, which is a documentary this week, and it seems sort of strange, right? It's a little bit out of time. It's like, why are we watching a documentary on 1969 to 70s in, while we're studying Indian removal? But I kind of want you to think about kind of putting these time frames together, right, and squishing it and saying like, why does We Hold the Rock have so much relevance to what we're looking at in terms of Indian removal? And honestly, it's about the reclaiming of land, right? So I want to have you all think a lot about that. And a little bit of background into this section is kind of looking into Native Americans and their relationship with the white settlers, or I should say Euro-American settlers, during the time when the nation has been rightly founded. So we have these, to begin with, we have these Euro-American view of Indians. This is really known as this noble savage concept. We can see this in the Disney version of Pocahontas, where Pocahontas is known as somebody who's really loyal to her tribe and one with nature and all of this, but still like not understanding in the ways of etiquette, right? And there's also this idea of just dangerousness seen with the Native Americans. They're not tolerated or really allowed to integrate into the new nation society unless they completely assimilate. Assimilation, which we'll kind of get to a little bit later as well. So coming back to Tecumseh, my hero, right? Let's talk about Indian traditionalism. So this way of fighting back against these initial pushes towards assimilation. Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh are two brothers in the Shawnee tribe. So the Shawnee tribe actually was really hosted in Ohio as a state in Indiana. So a lot of this land that we see, and the reason it's held I should say, Chillicothe, is because that was all Tecumseh's land. So it's really has rich, I guess, ties to this area. But he went around at the end of the 1700s and early 1800s to try and kind of create a pan-Indian movement, right? In the early 1800s, the Shawnees had lost most of the land they occupied in the area of Ohio. So these two brothers were trying to get Indians to return to their traditional practices. And this also challenged the white Euro-American sort of pull over these Native Americans. They invited Indians from all over the Northeast and the Southeast to come live in pan-Indian villages. Pan-Indian meaning all tribes, right? So they were trying to create coalitions across tribes. And a lot of these Native American tribes were at war and at odds with each other. So Tecumseh really was trying to spin this yarn of Native Americans coming together, as you can see in the reading for this week, right? So be sure to kind of check out the words that he's using to create this movement. And I'd be curious to see if you think of him as sort of a movement leader in that way, too. Whites, nonetheless, were angered and fearful to hear of Tecumseh's rallying call to all Native Americans. The Indiana governor actually attacked the pan-Indian areas, and he created an open conflict. He really wanted to just totally, he said, extirpate them, which means to like eradicate, erase them. This was a language of genocide, essentially, that would continue for the next 100 years. In the War of 1812, which we'll just get into really briefly, Tecumseh joined forces with the British formally. This, he hoped, would help to stop the United States forces. This was one central cause of the War of 1812, was this idea that they wanted to take land from American colonists. And the reason a lot of Native Americans sided with the British was that the British told the Native Americans that they'd get the land back to them. Other factors that led to the war included conflict over trade, in addition to these demands for more land. Unfortunately, Tecumseh was killed in this war, and that kind of put a stop to a lot of these pan-Indian alliances, unfortunately, too. At the same time, in the South, there was a general named Andrew Jackson that had allied with some Indians who advocated for accommodation with whites, which meant they were going to become part of this white cause and white force. And they attacked the Red Sticks, which is a group of Creek Indians that were part of Tecumseh's coalition. In effect, the Creek Indians gave 23 million acres of land to the whites, to Andrew Jackson, and they were pushed to the Southern Territory of Mississippi. This is sort of beginning this massive push of Native Americans out west, right, as the settlers sort of colonized this eastern and southeastern area. The British pulled out from the war after the Treaty of Ghent, but they left their Indian allies like much worse off than they were before. And kind of getting back to this idea of assimilation then after the War of 1812, these Native Americans are left without much hope. And in addition to that, in 1818, there was this House Committee on Indian Affairs that recommended that these assimilation tactics be used to assimilate these Native Americans. They said, quote unquote, put into the hand of Native American children the primer, which was a reading book, and a hoe, and they will naturally in time take hold of the plow, and as their minds become enlightened and expand, the Bible will be their book, and they will grow up in habits of morality and industry. The idea was that by educating Native Americans in a certain way, it could turn them essentially to sort of acculturate them into white culture. In 1819, Congress also gave $10,000 annually for the civilization of tribes adjoining the frontier settlements. And again, this could be seen as putting money into boarding schools and attempting to give different texts to Native Americans, teach them English. But it also really eradicated a lot of their culture, right? In addition to this eradication of culture and these attempting to teach Native Americans these American deemed, right, or European ways, there's this huge taking of land. In the 1820s, various Indian nations ceded more than 200 million acres to the U.S. government. 200 million acres. And the Cherokee in particular moved to legally fight back and maintain what little land they had left, which was in Georgia. So they were fighting with the U.S. government to say, can we keep this land? Unfortunately, as you all know, they did not get to keep this land, and the rhetoric began to shift on the direction that American Indians could not assimilate into white society. This should also be remembered that assimilation was exactly that Indians were to adopt white culture almost completely and maintain none of their own. So either way, they were going to lose their culture, right? In terms of these power struggles over cultural keeping, I should say. Negotiation was never really part of this civilizing mission. The Indian Removal Act was passed in 1830 by President Andrew Jackson, possibly the worst president to Native Americans in American history. And here we should note that there were sectional divisions in the national government. The North versus the South was already starting to really get this heated sort of drive, right? States' rights was starting to echo in these fights to sort of look at states' rights with slavery and also states' rights with Native American rights, which is really important to keep in mind as well. So the Supreme Court sided with the Cherokees in Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, but Andrew Jackson, who was the president, and the nation ignored this ruling, which was going to say that the Native Americans, Cherokee Native Americans, would be able to have rights to their own land. He was quoted as saying that the Chief Justice John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it, meaning he wasn't going to help enforce this decision in any way. And to the Georgians, he said, just light a fire under them, meaning the Native Americans, and they'll move. So really, this stemmed to this Trail of Tears, which you'll read about in the Zinn as well. And that chapter is really powerful, kind of coming at it again and seeing that account of this struggle and the terrible nature of things. This was sort of one of the last attempts, different efforts to push Native Americans fully out of their land and remove them from all the Cherokee lands. So faced with pressure in 1835, a small group of elite Cherokees signed a treaty of sorts that ceded all Cherokee lands to the United States in exchange for a little bit of money, some small compensation, to help the nation relocate west of the Mississippi. The Cherokee Nation, which was around 18,000, was given 2 years to remove themselves and move west. Only a small fraction initially left, and the rest stayed. They saw it as their land ancestrally and immediately. In 1838, following the removal deadline, state militia and federal troops forcibly rounded up all the remaining Cherokees, which was almost 16,000 people. Everything that people couldn't carry immediately was seized by the state. It took weeks to round people up, and they forcibly marched the Cherokees off. Most of the infants died before they even left on the march. Most of the elderly died as well. The majority marched from October to December in 1938, and you can imagine the weather during these days. Winter in the mid-19th century was not a good time for a walk in the wilderness, right? So during this time, some 4,000 people died because of the roundup and the forced march. All of this is to just give you a quick primer. I could go on about this for forever, and that's the challenge of this sort of format, but I wanted you guys to know a little bit about this forcible movement of Native Americans, and it would not only stop in the East, it would continue out West as well, which is really, really important to keep in mind too. As we watch We Hold the Rock, I want you to sort of think about this language of assimilation and also pushing people who owned the land out of their own land, which is really important to note that when, the United States began, there's an important map that I'll also put along with this slide. There were so many different languages. There were so many different tribes. It wasn't that the land was not populated. There were a lot of people living here already. So just something for you all to keep in mind, and thanks for letting me show you my favorite t-shirt. And I look forward to having you guys watch We Hold the Rock and hearing what you think. Thank you.